Hi, everyone. So we have about a minute left before we move on from the break and move into our next session. But I just wanted to give you a quick recap of what we have heard today. And, today's theme of the summit is relationships. And to be in good relations is to really honor and consider the labor and the emotional labors and the intellectual labors that have gone into everything you have heard so far. So I'm just going to take a minute here before we announce the next session and move on to acknowledge some of the folks who you've heard from so far today. You've heard from the Traditional Ecological Knowledge Club, who has been the lead organizers of the summits. You've heard from Dean Uskenhaller and Dr. Randy Rosenberger, who's an associate dean. Those are both deans from the College of Earth, Ocean, and Atmospheric Sciences and the College of Forestry at Oregon State University, who have helped sponsor a large portion of the summit. We also heard from Robert Kenta, who is a tribal council member for the Confederated Tribe of Siletz Indians, whose lands we are facilitating this conference from. We also are on the lands of the Grand Ronde peoples, and our next presenter is a member of that tribe as well. You've heard from the director of the National Park Service, Charles Sams III, and you have heard from Dr. Lahui Whitebear and myself during our land acknowledgement workshop. You also heard a very powerful keynote from Dr. Jessica Hernandez, and that was followed with an amazing performance from Notorious Cree, also known as James Jones. So when we think about relationships and we think about reciprocity and responsibility and the main themes of the summit, we all have a responsibility to acknowledge their labors and to be in good relations with them through our questions, through our comments and things like that during this conference. And yeah, it's been great so far. I appreciate you being here. We hope you enjoy the rest of the afternoon. Callum, I'm going to turn this over to you and you can facilitate the next session.
Hi all, so we're going to get ready for the next session. The session is titled Changing the Valley and Removing the Tribes. It's going to be a presentation, and after we hear from our speaker, we're going to have about 10 minutes for a Q&A. At the bottom of your screen, you should be able to see a Q&A box, and you can submit questions there that I will moderate at that time. And you can start, Dr. Lewis.
Callum, about how much time do I have, do you think?
You have until 15 minutes before the hour, about 45 minutes.
Okay, great. All right, hope you guys can see that. My screen share should be working. And I'm going to minimize this. Okay, so thank you for being here today. It's great to talk about this stuff. I speak in my classes about this all the time, and so it's great to be at a conference talking about it as well. I am from the Santiam tribes of this valley. Remember the Confederated tribes of Grand Ronde. I also have Takelma and Chinook ancestry as well as Molalla and Yankala, and so I feel very personally connected with all the information I'm going to share with you today. So first off, I wanted to start with this story, which is an oral history from my people, the Kalapuyans, about how we've been here, archaeologically. I think in this valley, it's considered 9,500 years right now, but we believe we've been here since time immemorial, and that it was at least more than 16,000 years. This story has to do with our people having to escape to the top of a big mountain, which was Mary's Peak, a significant mountain for the Corvallis area. And they appeared to have been escaping because of a large flood, and a flood that was so massive that it made people go to the highest peaks in the valley to survive. And so they didn't know how or why this happened, but they figured out that they throw some women's hair back in the water, that the water will recede, and it did. And so we think, many of us think from my tribe, that this is likely to be a Missoula floods story, which means that our people were here in the Willamette Valley some 16,000 to 11,000 years ago and witnessed and experienced these floods personally. And so this is actually then history that goes back some between 11,000 and 16,000 years ago, suggesting our people have been here a very long time. And a lot of questions come out of this for me as a scientist and for my people about what our land was like back then. What was it like before the flood? What was it like after the flood? And I'm not sure we're going to get to that in this presentation, but something to think about. We've been here a very long time. And let me just continue on. Here's basically a short survey of the peoples of Western Oregon. Here are the lands of the Chinookan peoples and Klatskanai and a few Tillamook's along the shores of the state and Washington state, as well as the Chinookan peoples of the Columbia down to at least the Chutes area. And you see there's a good number of different tribes and bands of the different Chinookan nations up and down the river. There wasn't just one, there were several. They were not all just one Chinook people. There were numerous different Chinook peoples that had different names. The folks in our area that concern us here in the valley were the Multnomah, Cascades, Clackamas, and Kwaliwalla peoples of this valley. They lived, Clackamas and Kwaliwalla were the principal tribes that accessed Willamette Falls, which is in the Willamette Valley. And then let's continue on down. We have the Kalapuya tribes. There were between 13 and 18 different Kalapuya tribes and bands up and down the valley. Here's my latest map of them that includes additional bands that were found in some new treaty pages that I discovered a couple years ago. But we see that there's a good number of Kalapuya bands and tribes. The tribe in our area, the Chinapfana or Chipinafu is another name for them. Mary's River also in the Corvallis area, but all these tribes are significant, like the Santiams are right across the river right here. We have the furthest south, Yonkal, the furthest north, Tualatin. And then we're also Molalla peoples and Clackamas in this valley as well. And so quite a bit of intertribal interactions in the valley that all access the resources in this place. We also have further on down south, two other valleys, the Umpqua Valley and the Rogue River Valley. There were at least 5 tribes and 5 different languages spoken in the Umpqua Basin. The Cow Creek spoke Takelma, Mollallans. Upper Umpqua spoke an Athabascan dialect. Yoncalla spoke Kalapuyan, and Lower Umpqua speak an isolate or spoken isolate. And so these peoples are all in the Umpqua Valley. And then further on down south, we have all the Takelma peoples and Shastas and Athabascans that were in the further southern area of Oregon, crossing over into Northern California. And so those are all the tribes of Western Oregon. They all had very similar cultural characteristics, mainly because a lot of our lands had the same resources. We had salmon, we had elk, we had deer, we had Camas, we had Wapato, we had acorns all throughout these valleys, really kind of in different percentages based on whether you're upland or down or a valley land or you're living on the rivers. And so that would be something to study, that those differences and how and similarities in terms of all the tribes. For the Columbia River, our best perhaps notes before everything was changed are from the Lewis and Clark expedition. They came and documented a good number of tribes up and down the Columbia, maybe 10,000 to 16,000 in the Willamette Valley area alone, which is basically the Portland area right now. And all these stars would be major village sites and probably Wapato gathering sites, because Wapato was the great draw into the valley for all these people. Salvia Island was ringed with different villages, and the whole area is a well-known Wapato gathering zone, more so in some respects than salmon in the area, even though salmon was the major fish, the major economy. Wapato was the major draw for people moving into this valley in around October, spending 4 or 5 months in the valley, living throughout the wintertime because it was a middle milder climate. And then for the Cascades, moving back into the Columbia Gorge in around April and May to catch the fish runs that coming to their land there. And so we see lots of interaction. Lewis and Clark happened to capture in their return trip the tribes packing up and leaving this area and moving back into their land at Cascade Locks, Cascade Rapids area. And so that's a kind of a vignette into that time period. An image we don't really get of the tribes later on because they, as I'll describe, they were heavily impacted by the fur trade, by disease, and by settlement. One of the things that made all our systems work is a kinship. Everybody was interrelated with each other. The Kalapuyans and Chinookans and other tribes in the region all intermarried with one another, and so they didn't have a kind of a warlike experience with each other because they knew that they had to have trade, they had to have peace, they had to have friendship with each other, companionship, in order to respect for each other, in order to have wealthy and healthy tribes. And so that's really the story of the Lower Columbia and the story of the Willamette Valley, because the Kalapuyans and Molalans are all part of that trade network, what we call the Columbia River Trade Network. And being related to other people really helped with that that feeling of camaraderie, of family, and really helped the trade relations up and down the Columbia. So our best example of that is Kiasno, who was a Multnomah chief in the mid 19th century. He was related to people, the Clatsop tribe, through his wife. He was related also to the Cascades, the Cascade Locks. He also had in-laws and relations with the Kalaliwala and Clackamas people and the Tualatin people. So he, under one sort of powerful chiefdom, he brought together a lot of friends that would support and help him if he needed help on the Columbia. And a lot of folks knew this until he kept his power until he died in 1848. After that, most of the tribal relations in the area change, and we'll see what happens there in a second. One of the things that makes the tribal lifeways really kind of unique and interesting is this idea of seasonal rounds. The tribes had these seasonal round is just a device for understanding how their annual year worked. They didn't stay in one place, or most tribes didn't stay in one place. They actually moved around quite a bit to places where they could harvest either animals or fish or plants, mostly plants, because plants that didn't move towards them or didn't wander across their land. And so they would move around to these places in the mountains or in the prairies, in the foothills, on the edges of ponds, swales, rivers, to harvest different kinds of crops when they're ready throughout the year. And that seemed to look to settlers and explorers as wandering Indians. It wasn't really wandering, because they did the same pattern over and over again each year for hundreds, if not thousands of years, going back in time. And so it's not wandering if you know where you're going, if you plan it all out, if you have a calendar, if you have if you know what you're doing, and your family knows what you're doing, you're teaching it to your kids. It is your TEK, your nutritional knowledge of your land, of your environment, that you pass on through practicing it with each new generation. And so we see here large winter villages, because Oregon was really cold and sort of wintry back then. It's a little warmer now than it used to be. There would be sturgeon fishing in the wintertime, maybe hunting camps. Smelt comes in around February to March. We have maybe Camas root camp early on before they flower. Spring Chinook, spring salmon. They may go to a trade gathering to trade excess foods, excess products they make through the wintertime for other foods people have, other products people have. Weave materials camp, things like hazel and stuff is a good time. This is a good time of year to be gathering that. Camas root camp later on after it flowers, after it's gone to seed. Huckleberry camps later on in the summertime. Late summer, you go acorn gathering. You may set up fall prairie fire for the valley, and this was very common every year to see prairie fires throughout the valley. You may visit a fall salmon. If you're Kalapuyan, you may not have fall salmon camp. You may instead take your excess foods you'd gather throughout the year to places like Willamette Falls and trade for dried or smoked salmon from the Chinook peoples. And then weaving materials camp, hazelnut camp, and then Wapato camp. Wapato comes in around October again. It's usually ripe about that time, and people would start gathering it and storing it for the winter time. And then they hunted back to hunting camps and winter villages again. And so that's kind of the pattern in the area. And again, the percentages of each activity changes with each tribe based on their resources. The Kalapuyas are really interesting to me, mainly because I'm related to them, and it's my culture. I'm a descendant of several different Kalapuya peoples. They had a calendar which was collected by Albert Gatchett in 1877 at Grand Ronde, and it shows them basically collecting a lot of camas. They spend about 2 or 3 months dealing with camas, solely camas as a food, on this calendar at least, and then another few months dealing with Wapato through the wintertime. And so those are two of the major crops, at least for the Tualatin. They may have had other crops they gathered, but this is what's on this calendar here, suggesting that they spend a lot of time following a plant cycle rather than an animal or a fish cycle. Like, the Chinookans may follow more of a fish calendar than the Kalapuyans. So see, these are some of the animals they would have hunted and fished. Clearly, salmon would have been gathered, not at the quantities that you see among the Chinookans, who had a lot of fishing falls and fishing rapids. But ducks and geese, deer, elk, and sturgeon would have been all gathered and eaten by all the tribes. We also have a lot of different plants, like we've said. Those of you who don't know what camas is, here's your camas, which is up right now throughout the country, wherever it grows. You dig it up after it goes to seed, and you have these like dark colored bulbs. Then you peel them up, they turn white. They have a white. And you peel those out and you cook them in underground ovens, or nowadays sometimes in crock pots, and then for several days, and they caramelize and they're really good eating. And then we have our Wapato, cooked kind of like a potato, and they're very good eating as well. The tribes right now are working on ways of restoring Wapato areas so that we can begin harvesting it and bring it back into our food chain. And then we had some other plants that we grew, maybe tended to more like agriculture, like tobacco. Tobacco was planted next to longhouses, and so that would be used as part of our ceremonial activities. So we had lots of rich and fertile grounds for our Mamtu and Antip. These are the Kalapuya words for Wapato and Camas. Camas is Antip, and so, which is the Camas. So we're bringing that into use too again, the use of the Kalapuya words as we do some restoration activities on these plants. We have oral histories of how to gather and how to cook camas. This history here talks about actually using the same pits that you use for baking acorns for cooking camas. So there's a possibility that there could have been co-harvesting of acorns and camas in the same encampment areas, clearly in the same encampment areas if they have the same pit at the same time of the year, because even though you don't have camas up and you can't really see it in maybe September when you're gathering acorns, you still know where it is because you've been using that same field for hundreds if not thousands of years, so you know it's underground right there, so you may dig it. And there's a lot of camas still growing under oak savanna in this valley today. It seems to do really well in a part shade environment like the oak savannas. So that would be clearly an activity you would do. And they would cook it for several days using hot rocks. And then when it was well cooked, then they would bring it all out, and then maybe they may dry that and store it for the wintertime, for wintertime eating. And winter storage of dried food was essential. This is part of another Kalapuya story, how they always put stuff away. They always dried stuff. They dried salmon, they dried hazelnuts, they dried acorns, they dried tarweed seeds, they dried berries, they dried eels even. And they would put that away in underground, probably storage pits, probably dug into the side of the hillside where their houses were. And then they would rehydrate them and cook them up in the wintertime and eat them. And here they say they also used a large rock to mash the tarweed and perhaps acorns and even camas together into some sort of a mash or paste that they would eat. And so roast the acorns in hot coals, and they seem to do this backwards. I mean, a lot of our stories of using acorns, like from California, is where you harvest them and then you leach them out in water, and then maybe you mash them up. Well, what Kalapuyans were doing is they were getting them, harvesting them, roasting them in hot coals, and they dried them out. And then in the wintertime, when they wish to eat them, they rehydrate them in a soft basket by putting them in the water. That rehydrates them and begins leaching out the tannins. And then they boil them again. They eat them again. So they may mash them up and eat them instead, but that's what they do. And same thing with berries. They would dry berries out in flat sacks, and then they would rehydrate them for eating in the wintertime. So that's a pretty consistent activity. It kind of approximates a lot of our today people that store food for winters, and it's really important to the tribal lifeways, tribal economies, to have access then to traditional foods in order to live a good life. Here's some more pictures of this. The Camas flower in an oak savanna, this is the Bush Park in Salem. A very interesting, almost co-species where oaks and Camas seem to go together really well. They seem to grow better under the oaks, under some sort of an overhead, part sun environment, and that's what we're seeing as really important to the Camas nowadays in the valley. And then fall prairie fires, clearly an important event for lots of purposes, but for at least three of our plants, they likely had really super positive benefits. For acorns, clearly oaks respond well to fire, producing perhaps more acorns. For tarweed, the fires would burn off all the flesh, all the sticky sappy stuff, and then they would roast the seeds, making it available for harvesting then. And for Camas, probably burning off the land would eliminate competitors, and the plant is surviving underground just fine in its bulb. So clearly there's benefits for at least these three plants, and probably others as well. As we do more studies and bring out more information, we're going to find more and more plants, traditional plants, that did well in a fire environment and would come back every year, plentiful and bountiful for basically making that wealth of the landscape that we're talking about. In around the 1830s, a major big change to the tribes came with disease coming in, mainly probably brought by fur traders. The malaria infected men may have gotten landed on by area mosquitoes, Anopheles mosquitoes, and they took the disease to other people, all the native people, killing somewhere between 75 and 97% of the people in various villages. There seemed to be a higher percentages among the Kalapuyans, a lower percentages among the Chinookan peoples. But with this what happened within a few years, people had to abandon all their outlying villages, and they condensed and constricted down to smaller habitations. Probably the main villages in most areas, and leaving a lot of land open for settlement. And so the Americans saw this. The missionaries that were there in the 1830s saw this, and wrote back to and took news back to the East, to the United States, saying, all this land is cleared off, it's ready for farming. And that brought a lot of settlers to Oregon and what's called the Oregon Trail, and people began coming for free land in the Willamette Valley, regardless of the fact that you didn't have any right to it, or the United States had not bought any right to it. And so they began taking any land they wanted to. And by that time, the Kalapuyans were so reduced in population and in power that they couldn't resist anything. Settlement forced tribes into smaller and smaller areas. And what settlers did was begin to plow up all the fields, all the prairies, where the food was kept, where the Camas was growing, where the Wapito was growing, in swales and swamps and stuff. Those began being drained and plowed up, and for all kinds of root plants. And then settlers were also hunting out the game and fishing the rivers, and so more or less and less of the wild foods were available for Native people to live in their traditional economy. So they had to begin adapting their lifestyle to the settler culture. They had to begin taking jobs and work with the settlers so they can get some trade in food and money so they can buy food. The problem is they were not allowed to own any land of their own because they were native and not citizens of the United States. They began being forced into smaller and smaller areas to the point where they basically were living at the behest of most settlers, even though settlers claimed the land on top of them. Some tribes in the area fought. The Kalapuyans did not, because they were too few to resist by that time. And so that's pretty much the story of settlement. And so we see these images of the traditional food, maybe the Camas fields, prairies being turned into monocropped, fields of grain, either oats or hay or whatever, or wheat. It wasn't until 1851 the United States got around to making treaties with the tribes. Those treaties all failed. It wasn't until 53 to 55 that ratified treaties were being signed with tribes. And so the plan was to remove the tribes to reservations. That didn't happen for a couple of years, but so the tribes began being forced out of their land more and more, with a plan to remove them. Because if they didn't move them, there were a lot of calls by American settlers to exterminate or commit genocide on the tribes. And so the U.S. government was not willing to go that far. They were instead working to move them onto reservations where they could be at least save the tribes from further attacks by settlers. And then by the 1850s, most of the bigger farms in the valley are formed. The farmhouses have been all built. There's less and less work needed by the tribes, and the tribes become nuisances. They become vagrants, literally, in the valley. They have no land of their own. They can't own any land. They're very similar to what immigrants are like when they first come to the United States. They don't own anything, and they don't have any rights. And the tribes didn't even have a right to become American. I mean, they were considered tribal. So they began stealing to survive, because when they asked for food, like true neighbors, would have given them food in their culture, but they were not allowed to have any food. And so they began stealing, and they began being called, thieves and vagrants. And anytime there was a crime committed by a tribe, like they steal cattle or something, the consequences of that were very, very bad. I mean, tribal peoples would be killed for stealing cattle, whereas nothing happened to the settlers who came and took the land and took the resources of the tribes. So there was no, it was a very lopsided, sense of justice in the United States at that time, because the Americans thought they just had a right to do whatever they want to do in the area. But by 1855, 1856, actually, tribes were being moved on to reservations to basically preserve them, and that's pretty much what happened all within 1 year. Some 4,000 Western Oregon Indians were moved on to the two Western Oregon reservations, Grand Ronde and the Coast Reservation. Here's our first map of the Grand Ronde Reservation. The tribes moved on here in about April of 56. Most tribes are on the reservation. More tribes arrived in the summertime, but the Kalapuyans are placed up in this northern valley right here. And at first it was a temporary reservation, but this became permanent because agents had put so much time and effort into it. They decided to keep it as a permanent reservation, that because it had good supply roads and had sort of fair farming activities. It wasn't great farming, but good with fair farming. So they decided to keep it. And this became the home of all of the Kalapuyas at this time. There were no Kalapuyas moved anywhere else except onto the Grand Ronde Indian Reservation, according to all of the federal reports I've read. The United States also then imposed its assimilation policy, which is based on the what I call a three-prong approach. Assimilate the tribes through exposing them to missionaries from the Catholic or Protestant religions, working to educate the tribes away from their culture, so putting kids in schools or boarding schools. And the third was to turn the adults into farmers, and farming was considered to be a worthwhile activity, whereas native culture was not worthwhile. So those are the three main ways they did it. So boarding schools come in a big way, off-reservation boarding schools in the 1880s. Before that, there was a few off-reservation boarding schools at reservations and day schools. They were not very successful, so the U.S. government began off-reservation boarding schools that were meant to sort of completely change the culture of the tribes to be Americans, to take worthwhile activities like blue-collar labor in cities and stuff like that. And so, and let's see. Agriculture was brought in, and most tribal people had to move to farming as their activity. They were promised that by Ulysses S. Grant, President Ulysses S. Grant, that if they became civilized people, they would become citizens. And they worked at that. It took 20 years for them to get any land when they got to the reservation, but in the 1870s began working at becoming self-sufficient and becoming civilized people by adapting to Catholicism, by making successful farms, by making successful American lifestyles. And even then, they were not allowed to become U.S. citizens until 1924. But still, farming was seen as the ideal American lifestyle, and they really excelled at that as best they could on the reservations. But reservation life was very difficult. They didn't get a lot of support from the government, really. For 20 years, they lived in poverty, and then after that, they were given some land, but it wasn't enough, and just enough resources to sort of make do. And basically, the tribes lived as kind of prisoners on the reservation for some 70 years or so. And it wasn't until 1924 that they were released to become U.S. citizens. But even then, there was plans by the government to completely eradicate the reservations through liquidation, and then later on termination became what the policy in Western Oregon. In this time period, tribes, because they couldn't make enough money, enough to live on at the reservations, they were not given much land. Clearly not enough land to sort of make a living at, only 260 acres at most. They had to adapt kind of I don't know, it seems like a seasonal round lifestyle, where in the spring they would set their farm as best they could with some crops, usually hay or wheat or oats. And then they would take off into the summer, in the summertime, to go harvesting crops through the valley. And then they would come back in the fall, and they would harvest their crops they had planted on the reservation. And through the wintertime, they would actually make things. They would make baskets or other things that they could sell in town. So they did what they could to make do, but it became this sort of lifestyle where Native people were constantly going into the valley. And throughout the summer, in family groups, they would harvest hops or beans or berries or black walnuts or something that was interesting and popular around, Salem or, Eugene or Corvallis or even Portland. Many people from Warm Springs even come over to Portland to harvest crops, or came down to Eugene to harvest crops. So Grand Ronde people went to places like, Wheatland Ferry and Independence and Monmouth and Salem. So it became a regular activity that went on into the 1950s. And I've heard of people, some families continue doing it as kind of a regular summer activity into the 1970s, even after the termination of the tribe in 1954. People just kept on doing it. And in fact, when I was a kid, growing up in the Willamette Valley, we were not living on the reservation because there was no reservation at that time. It had been terminated. And so we were doing it too. In the summertime, I would go off in berry buses and pick strawberries in fields and things. And so, and our family would go to U-pick sites. And so we were doing a similar activity to that, living in Salem at the time when I was younger. American farmers, settlers, when they got full control of the valley and Oregon became a state, they began changing all kinds of river fluxes, waterway systems. And one of the things I discovered in a little bit of research is that they destroyed much of the habitat for Wapato in the valley. I mean, Wapato, we know, was a big crop in the Portland area, but we know that only because we did a lot of research about the past. Not a lot of sources today talk about Wapato in the Portland Basin. But we also have a lot of Wapato in the valley, and two of the major crops were at Lake Labiche, which was a large lake above Salem. I've reconstructed here somewhat with GLO maps. A big long lake north of Salem, between Salem and French Prairie, if you know where that is. And in the early 20th century, some private landowners got up there and they financed a 6-mile ditch to be dug from Lake Labiche all the way to the Willamette River. And here's a picture of the ditch which they used to actually dig it. Actually, this is an actual picture of that time period of that happening. And they eventually created a way to sort of drain this lake all the way to the Willamette River, which created a huge arid soil, drained soil, which was perfect for farming. And this happened throughout the valley in various areas. These are just a few places I've documented. By 1918, the whole lake was drained. All the native plants, all the native animals, birds and fishes were gone, including Wapato that grew here. The same thing happened with Wapato Lake. This began somewhat later than Lake Labiche. The same family, or part of the same family, bought land at near Gaston, Oregon. And by 1935, Wapato Lake was drained. It was a much more difficult operation because it was a lot more water goes into that valley. The lake used to be a massive lake full of Wapato that had upwards of 10 to 20 Kalapuya villages around it, and huge flocks of canvasback ducks would come there every year to eat the Wapato and the fish and everything else. And so once they drained it all the ducks are gone, all the Wapato's gone, and it becomes a dry or semi-dry, lake bed soil, which is really good for farming. And this is again what it looked like using your GLO maps. I pieced it all together out of 3 maps. And so for some of the first crops they grew there were flax and onions, because they were really good cash crops, but they destroyed this whole environment. And right now the Army Corps, along with Fish and Wildlife, are working to restore that lake along with the Grand Ronde tribe. And so we're working on replanting the lake, restoring it, and make it again what it was before. And that should be a decade or so in the making. So the land was thought to be pristine by many settlers that came here thinking that they are going to make a living, get wealthy, and many of them did. They have kept their land, and now we have these sort of century farms or 150-year-old farms that have been in Oregon for a very long time. Tribes don't ever have that because we never had any land, and so there is no tribal or native century farms out there. But there's a 2 times removal. This sort of anthropogenic changes happened. You remove the tribal influence, the tribal, setting fire to the land, tribal harvesting the land. That's one change to the land. And then the second change is brought by settlers who bring their own ideas about managing the land and this idea of extracting wealth from it and resources as much as they can. The tribes saw, huge loss of food, loss of land, loss of ability to store winter foods, loss of ability to travel across their land freely, which caused massive starvation. The Indians were called vagrants, and settlers want to get rid of them. And so they were eventually gotten rid of to reservations. And so much of what has happened to us is still being recovered. We don't really know exactly how many changes happened to the land. This idea that, fire was an important part of our land is pretty common. And that we're working on that in various ways throughout, the West. But this idea that much of the land was drained and maybe we need to be putting water back into the land is another I think, core concept we need to really grasp on. How much of this valley had been sort of shallow swales or shallow lakes, seasonal ponds, seasonal lakes that the plants and animals and fishes and everything else use to survive, and people use to survive, and how much has it been drained and turned into basically a monocropped agricultural wasteland where nothing, hardly anything wild grows. And so I think that we need to really think about this interplay between water and fire and sort of figure out how we can restore the land using both of the restoring both of those things into this land. So we're basically now we're working on cultural restoration. This has been a project of the tribes for a couple of decades now, a couple of generations now, as you're going back. And for our sustainability, we need to restore parts of our environment to get there. Our culture grew up in a certain environmental landscape. And so we need to restore parts of that so that we can get back to some sort of a semblance of what we call our culture. We need to also confront these settler-born notions of land values, sort of what we call colonial values of what land means, or what responsibilities land is, or what is the worthiness or worthwhileness of wild landscapes on our land, and maybe allow those things to come back. So we feel as tribal people responsibility to steward the land and water. I think we need, at some point, we need to be helping everybody understand that, that if you're all going to live here and have a future that is not full of, of death, of, fire burning all of us down or whatever, then we need to be stewarding land back to some responsible, mixture of agricultural and, traditional landscape. And we need to do maybe continued studies on all these things, all these topics, in order to understand more about the past, so that we can go moving into the future with a good idea of what it should look like. So that's all I have at this time. I think we have a couple extra minutes for questions, but I can stop my share here. And
We do. So if anyone has questions, like I mentioned earlier, you can put them in a Q&A box. So the first question is, can you speak more towards the termination of the Grand Ronde? Was the push by the U.S. government to become more civilized, which is in quotations, the reason the federal termination was executed?
Yeah, the Western Oregon tribes were terminated under Public Law 588, and that was Siletz and Grand Ronde and all the other tribes that lived in Western Oregon that didn't have land, including Coos and Coquels and those folks. But that wasn't necessarily related to the idea of civilized. I mean, the idea of becoming civilized I mean, I think that's a theme that runs through everything. This idea that, tribes are tribes because they were non-civilized people and therefore they don't fit into white society. And that's, maybe that's a theme running through everything. But that was really important, like back in the 19th century when they first ran this idea of assimilation and forcing kids really into boarding schools, literally going on rounding up kids in reservations, take them to boarding schools on buses. And so that was somewhat decided by 1924 when the tribes got American citizenship under the Federal Act. And for at least Grand Ronde, I can't say this is the same for all the tribes, at least for Grand Ronde, we live kind of poorly with continued reductions in land into the 1940s. As people got their titles to their land after the Dawes Act, they began selling them off because much of the tribal land in Grand Ronde, the reservation, is not that good for really farming, and farming was considered the worthwhile activity of the time. And so you couldn't make any money out of Grand Ronde unless you did sort of like specialized activities or something. A lot of people were moving away to cities to make any kind of living. And so the few people that kept land, survived as best they could. By 1950, there was only 597 acres left on the whole reservation. So a pretty dramatic decline from the original reservation being 60,000 acres. And so, by the 1930s, we were considered to be, running our own affairs. By 1936, we got a Reorganization Act, a Constitution. We were electing our own officials. Not that we hadn't done that before, but we accepted a Constitution to do that at that point. So we're running our own affairs. We had businesses like the canning industry at Grand Ronde. So a lot of people were doing very well, as best they could under conditions. It's just that the federal government, wanted to use our land and all the other tribal land for better purposes, like they wanted to take it and give it to the logging companies to log off our land or something. And so those questions are somewhat unrelated. I mean, I think there's a theme that runs through everything about that, but termination happened much later than this idea of needing to be civilized. By the 1950s, when termination came around, we were considered civilized. We actually are on a list of civilized Indians at the time, which is why they went after us first for termination. They went after tribes that were considered uncivilized or only partially civilized later on, but we were one of the first on the list, so we had done well towards being civilized and being assimilated.
The next question is, what are your thoughts about beavers' roles bringing water back to the land?
Beavers' rules. Yeah, beavers should be introduced again. I think beavers are creators. They in our culture, in our oral histories, they create environments. They create lakes and ponds, and they create habitat for all kinds of species to grow and so they absolutely should be brought back. As I think we need to be looking into also ways of getting rid of some of these ditches that were built to drain the land. Maybe introducing beavers or introduce more. That's a good thought. Introducing beavers, we would introduce maybe more damming activity that would dam up even the ditches and would allow the water to stay on the land longer, and we would have more wild, more habitat for wild species. Yeah, absolutely. Sounds good.
One more question, since this might be a lengthy answer. The person says, wonderful presentation. You have explained how many keystone species have declined. Do you have publications that characterize the relative contributions of those different plants and animals to traditional diets in your region?
I don't have any. I mean, I have a few things like on my blog site. I do the Indian History Research blog, which I call the Cortex Journal. It's got a bunch of stuff on it. Most of that stuff is just ideas and experiments I'm working on, that I plan to turn into full publications later on. But a lot of it is interesting ideas that informs my work today. But I don't necessarily have any big publications on TEK right now. There's a few things out there, but nothing big right now. So
So the next question is, what are some impacts of the water diversions and impacts that the diversions have had on the people?
yeah, that's a good question. That's one of those. I mean, I only did this research on draining the water in the valley. This idea of getting rid of swamps and marshes as being wasted areas, back in December. And so I think more work needs to be done on this, looking at different areas like the Eugene area, the Corvallis area, the Salem area, the different valleys in the area, to see what kinds of activities happen by farmers and by land speculators, because really this all happened by land speculators. I mean, the people from they were related, they owned in part the San Jose Mercury newspaper, and their kids came up here and they used some of their money to buy 1,000 acres by Lake LaBiche, and they bought it on the cheap because the acreage was mostly in the lake. And what their plan is to drain the lake off and then resell the land for much higher values, because once it's become farmland, the land values skyrocket, and it became one of the most popular, most valuable pieces of land in Oregon today. And because farming back then was way more important than it is today. So it was really a land speculation deal. And the same thing happened at Wapato Lake. It was all by land speculators. It wasn't really farmers were involved, but it wasn't really the farmers doing it because they didn't have any money. It was these speculators did it. So I think a lot of work needs to be done on figuring out, so what is the cost? What happened to our peoples, to the valley? Can we reconstruct in different time periods what the valley looked like and how things have changed since that time? Areas like environmental history may be helpful, or water history or something like that. So yeah, I agree. More work needs to be done. It's not a complete story yet. It's just a beginning.
I have time for the last question. Last question says, David, well thought, research, and excellent presentation. Is it possible to get your PowerPoint presentation and cite your work on future story map?
If you want to do that, let me contact me directly. It's possible to get it. I don't want to release everything because not all images are mine. I can release pieces of it, or give you a limited license for that, but you need to contact me directly through the university. So yeah.
That's our last question. So we can wrap up this session. Thank you, Dr. Lewis, for presenting. That was great. And we'll have about 7 minutes until our next session.
Great, thank you.